Leadership is a team sport. And I worry because I see far too many leaders take on all of the burdens of leadership on their own. And that heaviness, that weight can be extraordinary. And I think does, in fact, lead to some leaders breaking and cracking and or being less effective than they might otherwise be.
Welcome to Science of Leadership, the podcast dedicated to helping you become a better leader. Here, you'll gain valuable knowledge, hear inspiring stories, and learn the scientific principles that promote exceptional leadership. I'm Tom Collins, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on this journey to becoming a better leader. Today, we're going to explore a topic that every aspiring leader should be thinking about. What are organizations really looking for in their leaders? I'm honored to have Dr. Jay Lemons with us, someone uniquely positioned to answer that question. Among numerous leadership roles in academic institutions, Dr. Lemons is the former president of Susquehanna University. Born out of his passion to work with new and emerging leaders to help them build their teams and institutions, he is now the president of Academic Search, one of the nation's premier firms for higher education executive recruitment. His work has helped institutions across the country find the right leaders to guide them through change, growth, and challenge. Jay, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me today on the Science of Leadership.
Thank you, Dr. Tom. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be with you.
Well, Jay, you've been involved in hundreds of leadership searches across higher ed and beyond. When organizations start looking for a leader, what would you say are the traits or the qualities that consistently rise to the top of that list?
You know, Tom, I think everyone begins these journeys with a sense of looking for, if you will, that leader who will have everything. And there's an elusiveness to this, and there's a bit of a siren call. I'll answer your question, but I'd almost like to come back and reflect a bit on that.
Sure.
I'm gonna go to something that really is beyond my own observation, but is really a product of a national study that Academic Search and our parent organization, the American Academic Leadership Institute, along with a couple of our Washington, D.C. presidential associations, championed about a year and a half ago. Those two presidential organizations are the American Association of State Colleges and Universities and the Council of Independent Colleges. And we had a fabulous response across the higher education sectors. You know, the competencies of effective leaders in the minds of those who are sitting in college and university presidencies. So the national study was done by Kevin McClure, a researcher and faculty member at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and Jorge Bermecki, who is at Howard University as a faculty member. And what they found, it was reported in the survey research that was done, that college and university presidents believe that, at the top of the list is trust building. Second, the ability to demonstrate resilience. Third, what they called communication savvy, an ability to effectively and authentically, in both informal and formal settings, was regarded as an essential skill. Fourth, they put a premium on emotional intelligence. Fifth, the ability to lead with courage. Their open-ended comments really described resilience as a corollary to the need to be decisive and a willingness to make tough calls, with always that institution that we serve and its long-term interests being the focal point. And finally, the ability to use data and to steward and to generate or raise resources, if you will, resource management. And I think that is a really effective list of 7 sort of critical core competencies. Tom, I would observe that I found it immensely interesting because a part of our pondering was, has there been a change in a post-COVID world from a pre-COVID world in terms of leadership? And yet I look at these and they likely strike me as pretty timeless virtues. I think the emphasis on communication savvy is perhaps accentuated, and I would say not just in a pre-COVID world, but in the emergence of the internet world. You and I are both old enough to remember before we had this thing.
Yeah.
And I think so communication skills are ascendant and are more critical. And the use of data. We have so much more available to us by way of thinking about data. But boy, so many of these other qualities, if you will, the competencies, strike me as the very ones that have probably helped set effective leaders apart across time. In the world of higher education, the world that I know and love most, I often ask myself the question, and I had a chance encounter as a very young man with Father Hesburgh from Notre Dame. And I got to also speak with him, as he was well into his 90s in his office in South Bend. Could Father Hesburgh be effective today? Yeah, darn right. I've always thought that. And I think you could go back and identify lots of people who were adaptive and met the challenges of their time. So I'm going to come back to the start of the question. I may be rambling longer than you wish me to at this point, but every search for leadership begins with an ideal in mind. And an old sagacious person from the world of search once upon a time said to me, search business is all built on the search for what does not exist, that there are no perfect people. And yet we always begin. And one of my colleagues, Dr. Sean Hartman, when we get to the work on developing the materials to support a search, there will be almost always a desired characteristics list, and he calls them the unicorn provisions. Others call them, the walks on water provisions, or
Yeah.
walks on water but doesn't splash too much. And I try and stress to every search committee that I work with that there are no perfect candidates, there are no perfect people. That what
Yeah.
we hope we find at the end of the process is a person who's well integrated, a person of integrity with great energy, with great intellect, with the ability to communicate effectively. But at the end of the day, maybe the quality that we ought to be putting a greater focus on is how do we find someone who will be self-aware of their own limitations and help to surround themselves with people with complementary skills and abilities, because that's ultimately where I think organizational progress is built. The sort of myth of leadership as a singular activity, I think, is one of the challenges that I think we face in at least the American literature about leadership. And I don't want to
Mhm.
diminish the importance of individuals as leaders, but I think of it as something more than that.
Thanks, Jay. That was a thorough, certainly, answer to the question. Excellent. There's so many things that you said that I want to kind of touch on. One thing was in describing those qualities from that study, what I heard was six things that were not the hard skills, but what folks would call the soft skills. And then at the end, it was like, oh yeah, and you can raise money and you can manage some, whatever, some finances and things a little bit. But the reality is that it's these other things, and what you were describing fits well with my research in my book. That's character, competence, caring, communication. Those are the bedrock things that we need to look for in exceptional leadership, and
Yeah.
realizing that, as you said, there's no perfect, nobody's perfect, and I've been on search committees, and it is amazing the things that people draw up and say, we're looking for this person, right? And as you say, walks on water, and it's just it's laughable, honestly. If
Yeah.
people would take a step back and go, who in this room comes close to this? It's nonsense. But for the listeners, I think this point of really the softer things, the soft skills as they're called.
100%. I got to say, I was not surprised by this, but I know that it was a bit of a surprise for many others who were close to the project. For me, it's old wine in new bottles. It is the soft skills that really matter about effective and leadership. Yeah.
Would you say that those qualities differ depending on the size or the type of the organization? Or, I mean, clearly we've just discussed that they're universal qualities and so forth. But do you see amongst different organizations and sizes, or their foci, if you will, that are different with regard to those things?
Our survey sample included 700 presidents from institutions that were very small and private to very large and public. There was not a great variation among institution types. Now, we did see some differences emerge around the personal identities of the people occupying those posts, where there's some very real, gender and racial differences. But I actually believe that that this set of competencies applies across all institutions. Now, fit is something else. There's an element
Mm.
of fit. I'm someone who, while I could have easily been on a path to serve large institutions, was shaped as an undergraduate by my experiences in a small liberal arts college, Nebraska Wesleyan University. That completely shaped my vision. And I served 3 R1s in the University of Nebraska, in Texas A&M, and the University of Virginia. And I found myself loving people and the work in all of those places. And frankly, one of the oddities is Texas A&M. I would point to and say that much of what I tried to do was attend to culture, in the way that Texas A&M is almost uniquely, in this country, for a very large place, tapped into thinking about culture and having a really distinctive culture. I knew that for me, that ability to have my arms around a whole of an institution, and to know its people, was just going to be an environment that, frankly, I think fed my soul, most generously. And I think that my style was probably more effective in that environment where it did matter that I knew, every employee, by name, and very often knew about their families. And with 2,200 students, I was able to know a very large number of my students and to know their stories and to watch them grow over 4 years. That was something that was a part of the energy that fueled me over, my 25 years in two small college presidencies. There are others who have the gifts far greater than I do to, I think, imagine and think about the impacts of systems, that large institutions like, your own or the ones that I serve, the societal, impact in every form of life brought on by research and teaching, and service. And I deeply appreciate that that's a set of gifts, that ability to almost live at 40,000 feet and to be kind of above, it all, but facilitating, the extraordinary reach of those institutions. That's the giftedness that was different than for me. So I think, but I still think at the end of the day that the core set of competencies
Mhm.
really matter, whether your altitude is 40,000, or 500 feet in a
Yeah,
helicopter.
I agree with that. I think that, again, fundamentally, great leadership is great leadership. Doesn't matter the scale per se, but when you do talk about certain roles, there are other factors that come in, and it is whether that's the strategic, big picture, kind of 40,000 foot view, as you were saying, or something close to the ground, and I think that really depends on the person and what
Yeah.
their greatest, let me say, passion may be. For you, it's clearly relational. Like relationship is very important, and that may be important for a president of a large R1 university, but maybe not as much as some other component, that they bring to the table. So certainly there is variance there.
Well, and I don't want to, for a moment, suggest that we don't have R1 leaders that are extraordinarily gifted in the interpersonal realm, because we do. We have
Sure.
some amazing people who are able to, to navigate differences in elevation.
Just for listeners who aren't necessarily in academic spaces, R1 is the highest tier with regard to research funding. So they garner the most extramural, that is money from outside their organization, geared toward scientific research and discovery. So they're the top of the food chain, if you will, of academic research and educational endeavors in the U.S.
Typically are larger in size and, in scale. Yep.
Hey, I'm breaking into the podcast conversation here to share with you an exciting announcement. If you've been following the Science of Leadership podcast for a while, you've heard me talk about the book I've been working on. Well, I'm delighted to share that after over 3 years of work, my book, The 4 Stars of Leadership, is finally available. I'm so proud of this book and what it represents. I'm certain that you're going to find it immensely interesting and helpful as a guide on your journey to becoming a better leader. Seriously, you don't want to miss this book. I'm including a link to the book in the description. I hope you'll order your copy today. And please share it with others who might be interested. Also, please be sure to share your thoughts about the book with me. Now, let's get back to this interesting conversation on the science of leadership. Jay, just thinking about some of the science on this, and you mentioned one study, but there are plenty of others that really have looked at organizational psychology and leadership selection and so forth, and really have found, just as the study you cited, that the best predictors in success really are related often more to emotional intelligence, adaptability, humility, interpersonal communication, than they are the ability to read a spreadsheet or create a budget or all these sorts of other things that we often conflate with leadership per se. I'm reminded of Daniel Goleman's work and all the work of others who've been in the emotional intelligence space,
Yeah.
looking at that. But Goleman showed that nearly 90% of leadership success in senior roles was attributable to these soft skills that we've been touching on, not the technical things that we track on a CV or resume or what have you. So I think this is vitally important.
Absolutely. It is. It is indeed.
Jay, I was wondering, are there things that you would say are make or break kind of attributes or things that a leader must have?
So I'm gonna, sort of translate between it sounds like one of your foundational pillars and this study and my own observation. The bedrock in my mind of effective leadership really rests on integrity or character.
Hmm.
That I think this is the most fundamental. In my estimation, life's just too short not to seek to try and have and build and maintain and nurture trusting relationships. And that always returns to character.
Yeah,
Being able to really push down self-interest, to understand that a leader's role is to care about something larger than ourselves. I have a very, very dear friend, a fabulous executive, who said that, her CEO once upon a time said, everybody has two letters on their forehead. M-E, me. And I think it's well to acknowledge that care and preservation of ourselves and our self-interests is that's that part of we're all human beings. And yet I think that the very finest leaders that we have had an ability to transcend their own self-interest, to overcome the me, and to understand that there is something of significance that's greater than our own self-interest.
I agree with you. I think that, if we look at so much of what's out there and especially pop culture leadership arena, if you do this one thing, you'll be great or whatever. And that's largely bogus. There's no single thing that you can do as a leader to be a great leader, but there are certain things that if you don't do, you cannot be a great leader. And I would say that character, just as you said, is elemental. You can't get more foundational than that. And that I can't tell you how many of the folks I've interviewed for my research insisted on that.
You said it. It's elemental. It's not possible without it, in my mind. Now, you can lead without it, but to be a virtuous leader and to be an effective leader and to be a successful leader that betters an institution or an organization or a corporation, it does come back to character.
The way I've looked at this, written about it, if you're someone in a leadership role who lacks character, people are always watching. They're always watching how you behave as a leader, what you're doing, and they see that. People recognize others who don't have character. They may be in the highest leadership positions in the world and demonstrate that they have zero character. You cannot trust them. They're going to change on you in a minute, that sort of thing. And so, what happens with those particular people is they surround themselves with this group of others who, by and large, also have deficits in character a lot of times, so that everybody's in it for themselves. And that those people that are following that would-be leader with no character are only going to be following as long as it works for them. And then as soon as it doesn't work for them, they'll be gone. And that person will not be leading anymore. But if you want to be someone who has lasting, significant, positive leadership impacts, it's different. When you have character, people follow you because of the character, not because of what you give them or what they may gain from it per se. It's because of who you are, what you represent, and the way you carry yourself. And that's the thing that has legacy. And I think that if we're going to be leaders of the highest caliber, we really got to be thinking about legacy. We got to be thinking about what's the long term from what I'm doing here. And that, just as you said, is not about me. It's about something bigger than
Yep.
me.
Yep.
So I think that's from my perspective. When I've thought, I've thought about this a lot and written about it. That's what it gets down to. No character. It may work, quote unquote, work for some short period of time, but it won't last very long. And when it falls apart in a major way.
I absolutely believe that. And you said, sometimes leaders who lack that elemental quality are surrounded by others who may have their own flaws. Of course, we all are. The notion that those who are a part of our leadership teams, they bring their own flaws. To be certain, you are right that teams that have resilience are those that have something elemental in the character of the commitments of the people who are together. That is when you will see leadership that can gain traction, that can move organizations and move them forever, not for some temporary status.
Yeah. And we've talked about what we're talking about here, and we've kind of described through research and other things why these things, character and other things, are so vital. I was wondering, if you have a story that you could reach back in your files and could share that really highlights someone with perhaps a less impressive CV who was chosen because of those immeasurable things. Let's say you got three candidates, right? And two of them have a history of doing great financial things or this or the other, and they're in all the societies and and so on, and in the circles of influence. But then here's somebody else who doesn't have those things on the CV,
Mhm.
but they had the intangibles. They had these immeasurable things.
The person who may not have had the shiniest objects?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
Well,
that's a good way to put it.
all
Yeah.
right. Well, I have to say, Tom, one of the things that I have been impressed with, and I have probably watched directly in this world at academic search over the last now 8 years, is that I now far better, far more appreciatively understand how critical leadership is because I've had the opportunity to step into, if you will, about 100 theaters. Well, one of my colleagues described this work as Dr. Stan Hales, the longtime president of the College of Worcester and a longtime member of our staff. Stan said to me, Jay, it's like I get to pull a novel off the shelf. I get to know the setting. I get to know and interact with the characters. And I get to watch an important part of their story evolve. And then the work is completed and I put the novel back on the shelf. For me, that's a pretty interesting description of this world and this work. And what I see, Tom, is that effective leaders make a huge difference in the life of institutions. And it's not always easy to know and understand whether a leader's been effective or not. But I see it in example after example. And by the way, it's not as if leadership is binary. It's effective or ineffective. It's good or it's bad. It is all on a continuum. I feel really fortunate to look back and to now realize, quite candidly, as a college president over 25 years, this is confessional. I just was running as hard as I could to do and represent and take care and steward and tend and to move my two institutions forward at every step along the way. And it was never something that I did alone at all. We can come back to that as a major thematic that rings in my mind. The reality was I just trying to keep my head above the water.
Sure.
And yet having a little distance from it, having then looked in at these other 100 theaters or so, wow, I see and recognize with my own eyes what a profound difference effective leaders can have on an organization, on a culture. Because, the culture is that which persists across time and through
Mhm.
generations of leaders. Colleges and universities are odd animals. In so many different ways. I really believe with I'm gonna this is a good one for a physician. For me, um, faculty and staff are just as important in some ways as faculty. I don't want to diminish the role
Mhm.
of faculty because they are the ones who determine, who we will teach and what we will teach and how we will teach it and so forth. But staff are often overlooked. Those are the people who carry the culture in their day-to-day lives, in their activities, and in how they greet and meet the world and their students. They are the circulatory system, if you will. They're the
Mm.
heart and the soul of the institution. Students are our oxygen. And the body's only going to be healthy when we have an appropriate mix of oxygen, fueling that the heart and the soul. There's a lot of pain in American higher education these days.
Yeah.
Much of it driven by demographics, economic challenges, and now we find ourselves in a period of really unusual, maybe even unprecedented regulatory sort of executive attention and
Mhm.
action. And so these are really challenging times, and it makes it all the more important that we have leaders who have the elemental quality. I got to say, Tom, I have walked alongside. The role that we play in these processes is a facilitating role. It's a
Mhm.
guiding role. It's an informing role. There's an element of it that is about organizing, and really facilitation is the best word. And I am overwhelmed by how often I admire the work and the judgments that ultimately search committees make. And I think that they do their very best. Do we get it right every time? Do they get it right every time? Obviously not. But happily, almost every search that I've been a part of, there have been dozens of people who might have all the right stuff. So that there you can be left a little bit with a wondering about, ooh, did we pick the right one? My dear wife always says to our kids, whatever decision we make, we're going to do everything we can to make it the right one. And I think that's what falls to search committees and the people with responsibility for helping to transition and onboard leaders is you move forward. I carry with me a story that I might just repeat because I think it's
Sure.
relevant, maybe of interest to you. It's one from Scott Peck, and it's probably among my favorite teaching parables, but, it's about the story of a dying abbey, almost no brothers left, all of them aging. There's a sense of doom, of the end of a charism, the loss of an order that had been multi-generational. The abbot, is aware that there is a rabbi, who keeps a small cabin, near, the monastery. The remaining brothers suggest maybe you ought to seek the counsel of the rabbi. He's a wise person. And so the abbot makes his way and shares a beautiful evening with the rabbi. Food, fellowship, the fruits of the earth and the vine. Near the end of the evening, the abbot says, I've enjoyed this. I've loved talking with you, laughing with you, praying with you. I, though, came hoping that I might learn something from you that could be helpful to us as we face our future. The rabbi was somewhat apologetic, but as they bid farewell, the rabbi muttered, somehow I think the Messiah may be within you, among you. And on the way home, the abbot struggled with what that might mean and returned. And at breakfast the next morning, the other monks were eager to hear. What did you learn? What wisdom were you able to extract? And he described the evening just as I did earlier. And he said something sort of cryptic at the end. The Messiah may be among you. And just as it had struck him, it began to strike others. And so, as Peck tells the story, Brother Dominic says, "Ah, it must be Brother Paul. He is always patient with others, and he has a certain gift." And Thomas thinks, "Huh, I think it could be Dominic. He's really good at organizing things and getting things done." And Francis, maybe it's Francis. He has a holiness about him. Well, they each had these thoughts to themselves, and it fundamentally began to impact how they interacted and saw one another. And one day, a couple of hikers along the way came and ended up on a visit, and they were struck by the spirit of the place. And one of them actually joined the order, and that led to others joining the order. And the Messiah is among us, I think, is something that's sort of lost. And by the way, you can strip the spiritual dimensions of this away in my mind. That these same sort of interactions in a completely secularized environment of understanding and looking at others and seeing and appreciating their gifts and being open to thinking about the power of our collective relationships. There's something there to me about effective leadership. And by the way, Tom, I think introverts have a hard time coming through these processes of presidential searches or even vice presidential or almost any leadership search. But as my colleague Ann Hasselmull says, we're not trying to hire the best talk show guest. We're trying to hire the most effective leader. And sometimes those can be people who take the world in and process it in different ways than those who do it well on a stage.
I appreciate your story, sharing that, Jay. I think great leaders see the potential in those they lead, those around them. Because if you don't, you're not going to be able to lead them. You're not going to have the positive bearing that you need to be able to do that. And so being able to see that humanity, the good in each person, what they bring to the team, that everybody does bring something to the team, and it's all valuable, taking that into account. And so I think that's highly effective and important. And I appreciate you putting that in the context of, the abbots and so on. I think that's really good. As we're kind of getting to the point in the podcast where it's time to provide some practical advice to listeners, I was just wondering, for those who are preparing for maybe leadership roles, whether in higher ed or, healthcare, business, nonprofit, whatever it may be, what would you say are the most important things they should be doing now to position themselves well as leaders in the future?
Saying yes, being open. Maybe some of the best advice I got came from a couple of really critical mentors of mine at the University of Virginia. First, when I arrived in the office of the president as an intern in my PhD program, Leonard Sandrich, who was the longtime executive vice president and chief operating officer, said to me, "Never be too proud to do what needs to be done at a given moment." You know, I watched Leonard do that and tried to model it throughout my entire career in life. If the chairs needed to be moved to make way to facilitate the next meeting, it didn't matter whether I was the president or a paid member of the staff. I was ready to do that. So I would deeply appreciate and say that Leonard's advice is something that everyone, and be prepared to do what needs to be done at any moment in time. And my mentor and friend, John Castine, said to me early on in my career, as I was asking him if he would be willing to serve as a reference for me, he basically said, "You're not going anywhere. I need you here." And I didn't think he needed me at all. But he said, "I just want you to learn all you can. Someday I'm going to ask you to do something." And I think that that's that willingness to say yes, that willingness to be open to doing different activities, doing things that may or may not be in your sweet spot or of your interest, but be willing to take some risks and to learn. It's pretty critical that everyone who is entering leadership needs to really know themselves and to know and understand what the mission and purpose of the organization that you're serving is, and to always keep that first and foremost. Again, President Castine, 20-year president at the University of Virginia, make every decision in terms of what's in the best interest of the university and its students. And those two are almost always aligned. So it will get you, in the higher ed context, it will get you really a long way down the road. In a healthcare setting, what's in the best interest of my patient? And what's in the best interest of my institution? Again, I think that this really is a helpful frame, and everyone could do that across every sector of human activity. And I think having that North Star, that sort of focus on who we are and what we do is really critical. Finally, I would say as people have opportunities for leadership, and by the way, I think there is leadership. Um, uh, you know, Leadership is not defined by how the boxes look together on an organizational chart. There are leaders at every level of an organization. And as people have an opportunity to think about and exercise leadership, I would urge people to think about the value of loving critics, those people who are willing to challenge us.
Great wisdom. That last one, I think, probably will catch a number of people off guard, sort of embracing the critic who will help us be better if we but take the opportunity to listen. I think so important. Jay, before we end out our conversation, one last question for you. Do you have a leadership maxim that you return to frequently to help keep you grounded as a leader?
This is going to be consistent with sort of the soft skills, with the trust building. I'll use my language and then I'll give credit to where it's really due. Leadership is a team sport, not an individual sport. Rosabeth Moss Cantor, Harvard professor, says it this way: leadership is not a solo act. It's best exercised in duets, trios, and small ensembles. And I guess I would say this, Tom, as someone who has been really immersed in and blessed to be in leadership throughout the vast majority of my life. I'm entering a presidency at age 32. It was not something that I had any plan for. And 25 years in institutional life and presidencies. And then the 8 years leading this wonderful organization that I'm privileged to lead today. We did an exercise at a retreat a year ago, and we had kind of a superhero thematic. And the opening exercise was, "What's your superpower?" Holy moly. I'm leading the retreat. I'm a part of all the planning. I know what's coming. I hadn't done anything in advance. I sat there in those moments, as all of us did. And what's my superpower? My superpower across the whole of the leadership that I have been able to be a part of is that I was never alone, that I was with extraordinary other people. While I may have been, the publicly identified leader, I was buoyed, I was nurtured, I was prodded from time to time by people, those loving critics that helped me. And so for me, leadership is a team sport. It is that maxim. And I worry because I see far too many leaders take on all of the burdens of leadership on their own, and that heaviness, that weight, can be extraordinary, and I think does, in fact, lead to some leaders breaking and cracking and or being less effective than they might otherwise be. So for me, it really does come back to Rosabeth Moss Cantor. Leadership is not a solo.
That aligns with an episode we just recently did. Do only what only you can do, and delegate the rest. Recognize that other people have great capabilities they bring to the team and allow them to do that. Well, Jay, I think that's a great way to end out our conversation. As always, been a delight to get to spend some time learning from you. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining me on the Science of Leadership today.
Been my great pleasure, Dr. Tom. It's an honor to be a part of your podcast and equally a part of your own journey in leadership. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Science of Leadership. We hope today's discussion has inspired you and given you valuable insights to help you become a better leader. Remember, leadership is about helping those we lead do great things. It's a journey of continual growth and learning. When we embrace that journey with curiosity, courage, and humility, we can confront challenges, overcome barriers, and foster environments where everyone can succeed. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to follow or subscribe, leave a comment, and share it with others who are passionate about leadership. Until next week, keep leading with character, competence, caring, and communication. This is Tom Collins. Let's keep growing.